Thank you. Good afternoon. So, Greta Harris asked me to come out and talk with you guys. She said, can you talk and break down structural racism, intersection with the housing market? I said, for you, Greta, anything. She said, 17 minutes. Can you do it in 17 minutes? I said, I don't know. And then, of course, I found out today I have 18, so I'm really not worried about it at all. A little bit about me. I am a local, born and raised here, and in fact, have done this work for a very long time, raised by folks who did work in social justice, and so I thought that's just what people did for a living. And then I went off to college and found out not so much. Ended up getting into the work around social justice and racial equity, and have spent about 30 years trying to figure out how we break down these systems of inequity and produce outcomes for people that really are more meaningful. Race Forward is a national organization that's been doing that work for close to 50 years, partnered with the Center for Social Inclusion, recognizing, in fact, that we have to address this in a different way, that if we want the kinds of communities that we deserve, we have to seek out and dismantle structural racism. And I'll talk about what that is in a minute. Our approach really looks at 5 things. We have to shift the narrative because we recognize the conversation on race in this country is broken. And so that means really having research about the stories about people who are affected by these issues, having them, in fact, build movement and capacity to change their lives and communities, that we have to have a new generation of policies that put forth a different set of results than we've seen previously. But none of that matters if we don't change the systems and structures that underlie and create those realities. And so we have a focus on institutional and sectoral change. One of the things that we've recognized is that there is a methodology that works that can help us to do that. And we see this in a number of institutions. And we break it down effectively to normalize, operationalize, and organize. And what we mean by that is if we normalize conversations about race, then we can start to have conversations about strategies that are aligned. If I asked you right now, write down on your index card your definition of racism, you'd first say, well, Dwayne, you didn't give us index cards, I don't know what to do. But after you got over that, you'd write maybe something about an individual act of bigotry, or you might act about an institution that produces an outcome that is disproportionately impacting people of color and favoring white people, whether it's on purpose or not. Or you might talk about the institutional systems interplay and the history and context that led to an environment that's oppressive for people of color because they have dealt with all these systems for many centuries. Those are all true, but they're not the same thing. We have to figure out what we're talking about and align our conversations so we can have aligned solutions. We also have to hold a sense of urgency and priority, right? This is stuff that took hundreds of years to happen, and some mornings you'll wake up doing this work and think it's going to take hundreds of years to fix. We don't have that luxury. There are people's lives who literally depend on us figuring this out now. And so how you hold that alacrity with the long game is part of the work of normalizing the conversation. Then you have to think about how you operationalize. What are the tools and data we can use to understand why these systems produce the outcomes they do, the results that they do, and how we address those. And there actually are racial equity tools that we see deployed in communities, in government, in multiple sectors that can help us to do that. But that means organizing our institutions differently. And not just organizing we think about in terms of the institution being organized from the community because the community is dissatisfied with the results from the institution, legitimate, but also how we organize within our institutions, how we partner in different ways, break down silos, how we actually do co-development and leadership with community, moving power to community to shape its future. And so that is part of the organizing we do, all towards the notion of visualizing the kind of communities we want to create. This is really the theory of practice that we use in many sectors. But I want to focus on government for a moment, and I'm getting to the housing piece because of this. We have a national network that is actually focused on these issues. And we are finding increasingly local jurisdictions committed to addressing racial equity because, frankly, they're tired of producing the same results they produce for dozens or hundreds of years. And so those jurisdictions at the local, state, and regional level come together, try to figure out the theory of practice, and then put that into action to make sure that, in fact, we can produce a different kind of result. So this network is called GARE, Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And this is, I call this the baby photo. This is January 2 years ago, the members we had around the country, and this is today. And so you can see the dramatic growth in this conversation at the government level, in fact, doubling in size every year since we've been in place. Why is government important when we start to talk about housing? A number of reasons. One is that this is an institution that has the leverage and the policy control to be able to shape and influence markets. It also has been deeply wed to decisions that, frankly, have created the inequities in community that we've seen through the housing markets for many decades. And it's an important employer for people of color at living wage, and it has the ability to really to transform negative ideas about our communities into positive messages as well. So a number of reasons that we do this focus and work on government. We also have to acknowledge the reality that government played a role in creating some of these situations, these inequities we're talking about over centuries, right? The notion of whose land it was, whose land we're standing on. I mean, who in this room knows actually whose land this actually was, right? Once that land was taken, who got to own the property, who was property, who had the right to vote, whose military service mattered, who could get married, and what that marriage meant. These are all things government played critical roles in for many centuries. And even as we know, over the last century, we saw, in culminating the civil rights movement, that there was movement for justice to try to change that, driven by community, government making change, actually culminating with the civil rights movement, seeing a new generation of policies that basically outlawed discrimination. Great news, but then we also stopped talking about race. It was almost as if by talking about it, we were hearkening back to when government was part of the problem. And as a consequence, we haven't seen the needle move on a lot of the outcomes, the disparities that we're trying to fix since the civil rights movement. What we're excited about is really the notion that we have a new generation of jurisdictions, agencies who are working to proactively advance racial equity in their practices and transform communities. And that's the work that we need to do, because as we know, no newsflash, race determines your life outcome literally from life to death, life expectancy, infant mortality, and everything in between. And so we have to figure out, these aren't natural disparities. Something is causing those issues. We have to break down and interrupt those cycles and figure out how we create different solutions. So those impacts of racism that cut across multiple arena, from health to community justice to housing, you name it, are the things that we're trying to figure out how we dismantle. Now, you could say it's a strong kind of moral argument, or there's a great, kind of mission focus to do this work. There's also a strong economic argument we can look at the local level. Just 3 quick examples. In Seattle, they recently figured out that if they were to equalize or bring down the unemployment rate of African Americans to that of whites, right, just to drop it that much, $25 million in tax revenue annually from the economic opportunity that's been lost because of that. The Twin Cities realized, in fact, that they're going to have a skills and job gap in the next 20 years where they won't be able to fill all their jobs if they don't cut the disproportionality between the achievement in school and the workforce of people of color and whites in Minnesota. And you might think, well, what does that matter? Well, they're rapidly diversifying, right? And as a consequence, that gap is going to make a difference. Recently, they actually were named the #1 state for livability, and they were quite excited. We're #1. And then somebody said, can we disaggregate that by race and see how we're doing? And so somebody did, and they ranked 45th. We're number 45. Doesn't have the same ring to it as we're #1. And as a consequence, they've really led into this work. In fact, we have as many members in Minnesota as almost any state doing this work. And then, of course, in New York, just to cities of scale, $8 billion lost from communities of color from the minority and women business contracting that's not receiving proportional revenue from the contracts the city lets. Right, so the scale is enormous, and that's just 3 examples from around the country. At regional scale, we know, in fact, that regions that are inequitable economically or racially are less resilient. They bounce back slower from economic shocks. In fact, they're less globally competitive. And we compete as a nation of regions across the world. And so knowing that, in fact, you have these inequities slows your ability to be competitive in the global marketplace. And then just the national cost overall. I also worked at PolicyLink for many years, and they have now a racial equity atlas, and they can look at the cost of inequity in our communities. Cumulatively in the United States, $2.5 trillion. Actually, I should say $2.4 trillion. I used to say 2.5, and I realized that 0.1 is about $100 billion, so I should be accurate. $2.4 trillion in lost economic GDP as a consequence of inequities we have. So we need to really think about how we can achieve racial equity. And for us, that definition is about this notion that we improve success for people, make sure that we don't have that race to predict their outcomes, and that it really produces outcomes that are beneficial for all people. Now, to do that means a couple of things. We have to focus on those who are worse off. If I were to do a study of the city of Richmond school performance and find out that whites were graduating at 75% from high school on time, ready for college, and that African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos were graduating at 55%, the solution would not be 65% graduation rate for everyone. That would be compromise. We want to see 85%, 90%, 100%. But to do that, we have to understand why are certain groups graduating at 55%. We have to start with those who are most impacted by our systems as they exist. And that usually leads us to race. The other thing we have to do is, make sure that we move from just doing the work of, supporting programs to our policies, our practices, our structures. And sometimes in government, people get a little, start squirming and say, but 82% of what I do is services. I just made that number up, actually. That's not 82%. But anybody here in government? Yeah, I said 82%, you didn't blink, because it feels like that sometimes, right? But the truth is, we have to start to transition to think about how we change the structures, the systems, the practices we have, or we won't produce transformational work. We can do great transactions, right? Literally moving an individual or a family, transacting them across a system to hope they get a better result in that system, but not transformational, where we change the system so it produces better outcomes for more people. People ask us, well, that's true, but Dwayne, why race? Why not class or gender, right? Or income, right? There's several kinds of marginalization we face. All of those are true. We lead with race for a number of reasons. One is, in fact, that the inequities that we look at race are deep and pervasive. Within heterosexism, sexism, ableism, you name your discrimination, if we disaggregate for race, people of color fare worse within that marginalization. We can't get to to equity if we don't deal with racial equity. We also know that we have to deal with the fact that it's the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about race. Raise your hand. Friday afternoon, you're at the water cooler and somebody said, Jim, what are you doing this weekend? You said, I'm going home to lead a conversation on race. I never get hands for that. So it's true. This is not the kind of conversation we want to have, and yet we have to find ways to talk about it. Now, interestingly, I used to say this 3 years ago when I started at Race Forward, and I'd say, nobody's talking about race. Now I say, everybody's talking about race, and it's still as anxious and difficult and challenging as it was when nobody was talking about it. So we have to find ways to have that conversation. We also know that if we can find systemic approaches to deal with racism in our society, we can apply those to other forms of marginalization. But we realize if I burst in here and said, I want equity for everyone, forever, I'd get equity for no one anytime soon. We have to have specificity and targeted approaches. So we learn from this work. We work with others in the alliance who work on other kinds of marginalization. Together we create the kind of communities we want to see. Now, why housing in race? To the point of this, right? We know that housing is a cornerstone of economic opportunity. We've heard that all day as we walk in this room knowing that if you don't have access to housing, you really are being left out of the market in the terms of your economic uptick, ability to move forward. We also know that historic patterns of discrimination really plague our history of housing in this country, and we have to resolve and unpack those things. And we recognize that cycles of disinvestment and reinvestment disproportionately impact people of color. You know, the cycles of losing money followed by the cycles of investment of money. You lose your house because you can't afford it, and the displacement happens. This is just the story that people live time and time again. We know that the housing crash of 2008 and 9 was the biggest loss of black and brown wealth in U.S. history. Unbelievably damaging. And the disproportionality in the nature of that loss was critical as well. And we also know that inequities in housing and segregation are deep and profound. So just to illustrate that, this, if you haven't seen these maps before, the dots are different races. And basically the punchline is, if the dots aren't mixing, we're pretty segregated. So here's New York. You can see a little bit of integration here, but pretty segregated. Chicago starts to break down. Detroit. So our segregation, and we could go slide by slide, but again, we only got 18 minutes in a lot of cities. Really, we can see the segregation we're trying to break down is deep and profound. So when we think about these definitions of racism, what we found is that we have to work at all of them, but particularly be focused on institutional practice to get to the structures that we're talking about. Because in our government systems in particular, a lot of the issues that come up aren't by design, right? But the design that's led to that point is still perpetuating, producing those outcomes. And so while we may not have intentionality in having people have worse outcomes by race, it still happens, and we have to address for that. So we know that we have to also change systems because structures will do what they do until we make them do something different. And that's really how we take on structural racism and start to think about these issues. Recognizing, in fact, that we have to look at the upstream, we are starting to move towards thinking not just about individual choice, but really our living conditions, the institutional practices, and the society around as the place where we can make that impact. And so for housing, one of the big areas is redlining. And so we have to unpack the history of redlining. Raise your hand if you're familiar with redlining. Okay, so I'm talking to the right audience. So we know this is something we have to do as well. A couple other things we want to hold is how do we deal with our own bias as it plays into institutions. And so we know that part of doing that is because if we don't change our practices, our implicit biases, the unconscious things that lead to us perpetuating decisions, we won't get to different outcomes as well. And so in that way, we focus on implicit and explicit bias, but particularly looking at the implicit bias that's in our institutions to make change. So how does that play out really, ultimately? I want to share, I think, a couple things. One, we know we have to look at changing our institutional policies at all scale. And so we recognize FHA, 20 years of existence, we're still dealing with the implications of some of its choices and policy decisions from the 40s and 30s. We know the interstate highway system really has kind of been the infrastructure, how we have exported sprawl, suburbanization, different impacts and levels of economic opportunity, and so we have to deal with that as well. And then we have to deal with things like restrictive covenants. These are all the kinds of things we have to take on as we're doing this work. To do that, we look at using analyses, tools that can help us analyze and understand these practices better, and then produce a different set of strategies to move forward, because we recognize that in institutions, public and private, we have choice points we have to face. small and large decisions that have cumulative impact in our communities. And so we really focus on how we can address those as well. So to get started on that work, we have to think about a few things. One, we have to think about the potential for achieving our mission by centering racial equity in our decision-making process. If we can do that, we in fact can develop a comprehensive understanding how those inequities have shaped the housing market in this case, and then focus on what kind of solutions we can address to make that change. We have to have a different kind of relationship with community than the one we've had before. Really community leading the process of helping us to unpack the understanding of these issues because they live the experience. We have to share national best practice, conversations like the ones we're having today, hugely important. We have to make sure that we have core teams in our institutions that will carry this work deeply and embed it in our institutions. And we have to make sure that we really use analyses to understand the impact and reach of these decisions we made before. Now, we have seen, in fact, examples of this coming up around the country. In Minneapolis, but very recently, some of you may have heard this, they're doing away with single-family zoning. They recognize that for the advantages it offers, it is too much linked into the patterns of segregation and discrimination that produce disparate impacts for their communities, and that there are ways to work around that. And so, quite controversial in its introduction, but it's starting to move into effect to be able to equalize economic opportunity, be able to have multifamily housing in areas throughout regions where previously that was not possible. We know Portland has actually done something they call the right to return policy, which looks at historic displacement of residents, particularly African American residents, and says you get preference in how we come back, get you back into community when we reinvest. Now, they couldn't, for a number of reasons, specify by race, but they could look at causality and direct a policy that gave opportunity for African Americans to find preference and return to those neighborhoods, even as they were being displaced. We also know that in St. Louis Park is one of the first areas in the Twin Cities to look at how they could have landlords deal with tenant relocation costs in a different way, and they use racial equity analysis to shape the cost structure and the nature of the program. So using evidence from our histories to understand how we can develop new policies to move forward. Recognize that in Philadelphia, they have a whole cadre of proposals that are on the table right now, thinking about how they can make change, looking at everything from eviction protections to looking at how they do housing bonds differently to public lands initiatives. But it's a public conversation looking at an entire suite of policies, recognizing the impacts of racial inequity in doing that work. Seattle's done a couple of things. They have a situation where month-to-month leases can only be ended by certain identified causes, so it's a just cause for eviction protection. And we also have done some work there around not making sure people aren't denied housing because of their criminal history. And then lastly, I'd just say there are a couple of national organizations tracking the things we're up against. So PRAC is looking at the source discrimination laws around the country, and they've tracked more than 60 of these around the country, which gives us a sense of where we have to do our work to unpack laws that are discriminatory in their impact. And then the Better Housing Coalition right here in the city of Richmond has been targeting its housing, thinking about how it interrupts patterns of economic segregation in neighborhoods. The last thing I'll just say is that there's an interactive map that you should look at, looking at states that have preempted things that could move our work forward, like rent control, just cause eviction, and it shows the states where that's happening, and unfortunately, the map is grim. So we have a lot of work to do at the policy level to unpack and reverse some of these, but we know by addressing policies and practices and institutional approaches will ultimately make the difference we need to make. Thanks.